I'm Professor G. Cope Shellhorn. I was a college English prof for 20 years. In 1984, I decided, after a few rather personal experiences, I decided to go out in the woods and write a few books. The first book I did was called Extraterrestrials and Biblical Prophecy. Now, about 30 years ago or more, Eric von Daniken said that someone should go to the Old Testament, New Testament, and other world scriptures and do a really thorough job. Well, no one had. The theologians didn't do their job. I had read Barry Downing, the Reverend Barry Downing's book, UFOs and the Bible, but he concentrated on the book of Exodus. Then there was a NASA scientist, Blumrich, who had done a book called The Spaceships of Ezekiel, which was very interesting, but that focused just on the book of Ezekiel. Other than that, except for a little very short book done in the 50s by M.K. Jessup called UFO and the Bible, there really hadn't been much of a treatment of scriptures, Old Testament, New Testament, pseudoepigrapha, apocrypha, or treatment of scriptures from other countries in the world. So one cold winter night, I sat down and I started to work, and I thought, nobody's going to ever want to buy this book. And fortunately they did. That, I guess you could say, launched my ufology career.
So how about the chupacabras in Puerto Rico?
Well, over the last year and a half in Puerto Rico, they've had a lot of, well, they're always having UFO activity. Puerto Rico's the most active place in the world per square mile for UFO activity. But around March of 1995, there were increasing reports of a strange creature that was mutilating animals. They call it chupacabras because chupa means suck, and what happened was that we had a herd of goats mutilated in Puerto Rico, and so the name chupacabra stuck. But actually the chupacabra creature, whatever it is mutilating just about any domestic or wild animal that it can get its hands on when it's hungry. But all it usually does is suck the blood. It doesn't eat flesh. Usually it makes a hole in the neck area about the size of a common nail hole, and then withdraws the blood from that. Excuse me. Sometimes you'll find marks, other holes on the torso itself, and on rare occasions it will go for the liver or the heart, and it'll make a larger hole in the liver area, and then seem to, with some kind of tongue or some kind of probe, it probes into the liver area and then feeds off the liver or the heart area. But most of the time it's interested in blood. And everything from rabbits, chickens, goats, cows, horses, even rats have been attacked by chupacabras. But I think it's important to say this: of the hundreds and hundreds of cases, chupacabra cases in Puerto Rico, we don't really have one verified, convincing instance of an attack on human beings. Several human beings have been touched, and then they freaked out. They started to run and tripped and broke their leg or sprained their ankle. But I say this because we're getting a few reports now from Mexico that people have been attacked as such. And Jorge Martin, the excellent ufologist in Puerto Rico, and I find it almost a contradiction from the evidence that we've turned up.
So what do they look like?
Well, it's interesting. If you put a composite together, you get a creature that, when it's standing on its two legs, approximately 5 feet tall. It's covered with gray to grayish-brown hair. The hair, and I have a sample, ask me about that in a minute because I'd like to tell you about it. But the hair is roughly 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch long, and it's fine hair, even finer than squirrel hair. It has a face that, and actually kind of body proportions that look a little bit like a kangaroo. a snouty face that comes down kind of kangaroo style. The eyes, when the creature's excited or at night, the eyes are red, slightly slanted, fairly large, and red. Although it appears that sometimes the eyes are blue and can turn a kind of greenish blue, but very often the creature's seen with red eyes. This, by the way, isn't unusual in the ET UFO field, find creatures with red eyes. It may have a lot to do with the light level from wherever they come. And interesting, well, let me finish the description of chupacabras. They have fairly long arms, a little bit meaty in the upper areas, tapering down to smaller forearms, and 3 digits, 3 fingers or digits, and with claws on the end. The feet, we're not sure, but we know that the torso area is fairly broad. Now remember, this animal is standing up in 5 feet. It's probably no more than 100 pounds or so. The torso area is fairly well filled out. The thigh area fairly well filled out, but below what we'd call the knee, the leg tapers down pretty quickly. The animal's very strong. We've got reports where, for instance, a group of people in Comunidad Rio Lajas, a little town in the foothills of the mountains, were watching these creatures, and they were in a bamboo grove. Now, bamboo's not natural to Puerto Rico, but it grows well there, and the bamboo gets very large and it's very strong. And these creatures were just ripping it up and throwing it up in the air, and with the greatest of ease. And they've been reported to throw such things as tires, car tires, that sort of thing, very well and very far. Now, in several cases, there have been ETs seen with chupacabras, and these ETs are very human-looking, about average male height, and they're white-skinned, white complexion. But what's interesting is that they have a bush cut. But the crew cut has hairs that seem to be black and very thick, very thick. And as a matter of fact, there have been immature species, what appear to be immature examples of that same species seen along with the mature species and the chupacabras. So I think that's interesting because in the beginning, when the reports first started to appear in Puerto Rico, we didn't know whether the chupacabras were just folklore and the people, you know, in the Latin romantic imagination. A lot of people tried to pass them off as that, or whether they were just some kind of creature from God knows where that might be real. But when I found out, when I started to hear that UFOs and aliens themselves might be associated with the phenomenon, then I got very interested.
So where do you think they're from?
Well, that's interesting. We really don't know, except there's a lady and her husband. It's Maria and Miguel Mojica. They also live in Rio Lajas, this little community in the foothills of the mountains, about 25 miles west of San Juan. And she's a remarkable lady. Jorge Martin is quite impressed with her. She's had a lot of experience. She's very convincing. She says that in the last year and a half, she's seen chupacabras 15 times. She said she has seen UFOs close to her home or hovering over her house 4 times. And she says, you know, usually when I see a UFO, the chupacabras will appear in a day or so. And she says, I think they're letting them go. They're coming from the UFOs. She wasn't completely certain, but I think she's probably right. This lady, let me go on a little more about her because she's fascinating. She said that now she hears in her mind, she hears inside her head, Maria, Maria, Maria. And she'll go to the back of her house and look out the window, and there will be 1 or more chupacabras there. Now, they seem intelligent. From all the indications of cases we've studied, they seem quite intelligent. I suppose we say that because they're not draining our blood, they're draining other animals' blood. But they seem to distinguish between humans and other animal species. Anyway, Maria took 4 photographs about 3 or 4 months before I arrived on my first trip in April. And she showed me the photographs, and they were of nests. They looked like a huge bird nest, really, on the ground. They had feces. in the nest. And I said, oh, can I have some of that for a sample? And she said, oh, we've had heavy rains and there's nothing left. Her husband fired 72 times at these creatures with his weapons, and the neighbor, a younger fellow by the name of Teofilo Cartagena, fired, I think it was 32 times or so himself, and he's had 2 direct observations of chupacabras. And as I say, he lives next door. He's seen them looking in his house through the window. Anyway, neither one of them will shoot anymore because they've come to the conclusion that these creatures are somewhat bothersome, but that they're relatively friendly, that they really mean no great harm. Now, interestingly enough, this lady has gray activity in her house too, quite a bit of it. But I asked her, is there any relationship between the gray activity and the chupacabras? And she said no. She said, I'm almost convinced there's not. So I could go into the gray activity, but we're talking about chupacabras here, and she's had some interesting gray activity.
What about the hair sample that you mentioned?
All right. I was out scouring the country, and I met a fire chief, and actually I stopped at a gas station, good place to stop, and ask questions, have any of you seen chupacabras, that sort of thing. Believe it or not, most people don't laugh. Once in a while they do. But the fellow said, yes. He said, go down and interview the fire chief. So I went downtown, went to the fire station, and unfortunately in April the fellow was on vacation. But when I came back in August for a couple more weeks of research, I interviewed him and videotaped him. And fortunately, because we're sitting there after the interview, and then he says, he said, I shot at one, and I have hair samples. And I said, oh, really? And he told me this. He said, the second attack on his animals actually raises fighting cocks, and that's a big business in Puerto Rico, expensive fighting cocks. And they were killing his fighting cocks, so he was on guard. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, in November of '95, he got up, heard a noise, went outside, saw a large blue fluorescent eyes that turned slightly bluish-green on him, and he shot with a shotgun. The next day when he went out and checked the barbed wire fence in the immediate area, there was hair on the barbed wire. Now, I asked him, do you have any domestic animals or any wild animals here in Puerto Rico or in the area that this hair could come from? And he says, I really don't think so. So right now, I gave part of my sample to Jorge Martin in Puerto Rico, and he sent it out to a lab, and I've got a sample at another lab, and we're going to compare notes. We think we've got something relatively extraordinary.
Wow.
I hope we do.
How about
I should add, I've got to say this, I'm learning very quickly how disappointing labs can be. I contacted several very well-known labs with good reputations, and when they asked questions, I answered them honestly. And when they found out there's any high strangeness to the case, they back off immediately. If they can't tell you what it is, then they don't want to give you a statement on letterhead. I thought, scientists are supposed to be inquisitive and open-minded and say, oh, we might have something new, Well, it's disappointing, and it's unfortunate because I actually had one of them say, well, was the hair touched? And I said, yes, I'm sure it was. The lady or the man took the sample off the barbed wire fence and put it in a plastic bag, and he said, well, have you touched it? And I said, well, no, except with tweezers. And he said, well, it could be tainted then. There could be a cell or two from your hand or her hand on the specimen. And I said, well, yeah, maybe there could be. But the point is, don't you want to really find out? There might be something very extraordinary here for you. And they don't. They don't want to have to write a letter to you saying, we don't know what this is, because their reputation's on the line, or what they conceive of as their reputation.
So, do you think you have no idea why the chupacabra?
Yeah, none of us know for certain, but I can speculate. It could be a bioengineering experiment that our government has done, or some other government, and they've turned them loose to see what would happen. Better bet, in my mind, would be that they are being released by extraterrestrial craft. There's pretty good evidence of that. Now, why? It could be these are servants, what I call servants, meaning they send them out to reconnoiter. Instead of sending out crew members, they send out these creatures to reconnoiter and bring back whatever they're looking for. Or it could be, and I don't discount this at all, it could be that this creature for some reason was in trouble somewhere and they brought it here because we had a climate that they thought it might thrive in, or at least survive in. Now, the reports, most of all the early cases were out of Puerto Rico, and still the great majority, hundreds and hundreds, are out of Puerto Rico and still coming out of Puerto Rico. But the creature now is being reported in Mexico, Guatemala, Spain, Portugal, Florida, southwestern United States. I said Mexico, didn't I? And so this is interesting. And it seems to indicate to me from where it's being seen, or allegedly seen, that we've got some kind of climate barrier here, that it needs a tropical or subtropical, very warm climate. I've got to tell you another story about someone very close, as close as almost as you can get, two of them. There's a young lady in Campo Grande, which is in the foothills of the El Yunque rainforest in Puerto Rico. She was in her garage and looked through the glass pane, and the creature was standing there looking at her 3 feet away. And this is not a woman that's easily destroyed emotionally. I mean, she could play poker, I'm sure, with any group of men and do very well. And she gave a very good description, which matched the composite that we have from other people. Well, go ahead.
Getting back in ufology, how about the death and dirty tricks in ufology?
Well, I just gave a talk on death and dirty tricks in ufology, and I should have called it sex and dirty tricks in ufology. I think it would have probably been easier to digest on many people's part, probably got them more exciting to boot. But we seem to have a problem here, and we're losing some ufologists under very mysterious, suspicious circumstances. Let me give you an example. Phil Schneider alleged that he was a geologist working in underground construction for the U.S. government. Underground construction that had a tie-in with bioengineering, black hole bioengineering, and in cooperation perhaps with an extraterrestrial species. Well, he was very controversial. A lot of people didn't know how to take him because he's the first one who's really surfaced who said he was involved in actual construction. I mean, these people they sign their lives away with these black hole projects, and if they break the code, they know what the consequences are. This is true of all intelligence personnel, for that matter, especially if they're involved in top secret or above top secret type work. Anyway, Phil Schneider claimed that when he was working in the Dulce area, they were going to put an addition on an underground structure. Right next to it, and he bored 4 holes. They bored 4 holes, like in a square, and then they were going to use explosive charges underground to enlarge the cavity, and then dig the cavity out further. Well, he claimed that they bored down there and bored into a nest of ETs that were right in the Dulce complex almost itself, right? Anyway, Phil Schneider died approximately July 17th of the last year, 1996. He had claimed for a long time that his life was in jeopardy and that he didn't have long to live. He also claimed that there had been 13 attempts on his life. I don't know what to make of that. I would think if someone was after him, they might have been more efficient than that, but you never know. He said, for instance, once the lug nuts on his front wheels of his car were loosened and he had a bad accident. He had MS. He also had cancer. So Phil Schneider claimed that in the Dulce shootout, there were 66 agents of our government and intelligence forces killed. There were 66 Secret Service, FBI, and Black Beret agents killed. He claimed he was hit in the chest by some kind of beam weapon, particle weapon, and that the cobalt radiation from that injury caused his cancer. Then he went on the road shortly before his death and was giving talks, highly controversial talks. He claimed he had a very high security clearance, that he had helped build 2 major underground bases in the United States and 13 other bases. He was, as I said, an explosive expert. He claimed that these underground bases were actually connected. First, there were 129 total in the United States, and that they were connected by magneto-leviton trains underground that could move at the speed of Mach 2 if they had to. That's moving, you know. That's faster, a lot faster than the Japanese monorails can move. He claimed that some of these bases here were a mile deep, that all were at least 2.66 to 4.25 cubic miles in size. Those are big operations. He claimed that in 1954 our government made a deal with an extraterrestrial species, and that's called the Granada Treaty, that we gave them the right to implant and abduct a certain number of citizens in exchange for some of their technical knowledge. It's hard, it's hard to know. It's what I can say of him what I said of what I used to say of Bill Cooper's remarks, and that's that if only 20% of what he said is true, we have huge troubles. He claimed too, by the way, that of the 157 F-117 stealth craft that had what we call LIDAR and other imaging radars that from 30,000 feet or much higher, they could watch you walk from room to room without any trouble at all. Actually, they could probably see the watch on your wrist. He claimed, this is a very controversial claim, he claimed that the National Ordnance Laboratory in Chicago created AIDS as a population control device. He said 11 of his best friends in the last 22 years had been murdered, and that 8 of those had been called suicide. Now, I could go on and on about Phil Schneider. Phil Schneider had a friend named Ron Rummel. Ron Rummel was only 35 years old in August 1993 when he died. Ron Rummel was ex-Air Force intelligence, publisher of a little ET magazine called Alien Digest. Now, there are only 7 issues that ever came out. It's almost impossible to get your hands in them. He was touching on no-nos, as we call them in ufology. He was touching on subjects that are considered highly controversial and also very dangerous, like the predator-prey relationship between humans and aliens, and whether humans are being used by some species as food. He also was very interested in the underground the underground construction and bioengineering aspect of the problem with a capital P. Guess what? He was a very good friend of Phil Schneider, and they were working together. Now, as I say, it's almost impossible to get early or any of the editions of Alien Digest, but the subject matter he was touching on was literally touchy. In late 1993, really early 1994, a young lady named Ann Livingston died of a very rapid form of ovarian cancer. Now, you know, many people get cancer, but we have in the UFO field, among ufologists and contactees and researchers in general, we have an extraordinary number of cancer deaths, rapid cancer deaths, even unusual cancer deaths. For instance, the famous biologist and researcher of extraordinary phenomenon by the name of Ivan Sanderson died of brain cancer, and so did Alan Hynek, founder of CUFOS. Alan Hynek worked for the government for 20 years before he founded CUFOS, and he was one of their spokesmen. He was the man they dragged out to give natural explanations for extraordinary phenomena. He was a paid mouthpiece, actually. Anyway, Ann Livingston had, in November of 1993, written an article in the MUFON Journal called Electronic Harassment and Alien Abductions. And in that article, she was quite critical of a woman named Julianne McKinney, who was director of the Electronic Surveillance Project of the Association of National Security Alumni. So she was touching on what we're calling today sci-tech remote viewing problems and potential abuses. We've got in Texas, California, and several other places private sci-tech firms, in addition to all of the sci-tech research and activity that our own government is involved in. And we know we've got pretty good evidence that even some of the private sci-tech companies have been involved in research on psychic warfare and that sort of thing. Well, that's not unusual. The Russians were much into that after World War II, and our intelligence services and military got heavy into it as well, and the Chinese are, for that matter. Anyway, on December 29th, 1992, at 7:15 in the morning, her apartment in the Chicago, not too far from O'Hare Airport in Chicago, was lit by an extremely bright explosion. And she could never find any natural reasons, explanation for that. That evening, she's an accountant, she went to work, she came home. That evening, in the parking lot, she was approached by 5, what we call MIBs, men dressed in black. And they're rather threatening. As I say, their clothes are black, usually, very black. She said their faces were obscured. They carried long black flashlight-like objects. She was approached by them, and then she has what we call missing time. The next thing she knew, she awakened and she didn't know what had been done to her. And I find that interesting. There's been speculation that maybe something had been done to her that caused the kind of rapid cancer that she had. You know, Carla Turner, author of Messengers of Deception, Taken, and Into the French, abduction researcher who died this last year, said publicly and privately that she felt that because of some of the statements she had made, especially in her last book, that someone may have decided to terminate her, and that her cancer, she had a very rapid breast cancer, and she had suspicions that it might not be accidental. Now, we can go back through ufology history. These are the notes I had for a talk I recently gave. We can go back in UFO history into the early 50s, and we can see some very, very well-known, very influential people at that time who died very mysterious, suspicious deaths. People that were pushing, for instance, for congressional hearings. People such as M.K. Jessup, the astronomer and archaeologist and very fine ufologist. People like James McDonald, who was an atmospheric physicist at University of Arizona and had quite a bit of weight, who had appeared before previous congressional hearings and was actively involved in trying to foster new congressional hearings. Both of those men are supposed to have committed suicide, but the circumstances are such to lead one quite easily to tentatively conclude that they may have been driven to what they did. Mind control has been going on a long time. As far as cancer and heart attacks are concerned, they're very easy to induce and have been long before the Kennedy assassination. And all of those eyewitnesses to the Kennedy assassination that didn't live more than a year. So, some died by the way of karate chops, several died of heart attacks, several died of head-on car collisions. So there's multiple possibilities there for speculation. Well, the same thing is true really in the UFO field. We've had too many very suspicious deaths. When I first published Extraterrestrials and Biblical Prophecy, there was no book of this kind on the market, and it seemed to strike a note with a lot of people. I'm glad I did it. It not only was it a successful book, but someone needed to go back into 4,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago and demonstrate, as Zecharia Sitchin, by the way, has so effectively demonstrated, that we have an extremely large amount of evidence to suggest that this planet has been visited by ancient astronauts a long, long time ago. The Hebrews used to call angels, as we know, the word angel comes from angelos, which is Greek. And the word appears when the Aramaic and other Hebrew scriptures were translated into the Greek, and then from the Greek to English and other languages. So you have translators translating other translators. What is significant, one of the things that I find extremely interesting is the Hebrew idea of an angel was a malaka, plural malakim. Now, a malaka to them meant a messenger. A messenger. Not an angel with wispy wings, that hardly substantial, but a flesh and blood creature, a substantial creature that came from somewhere else, from God, they thought, and was a messenger. Now you see how easy visitors from other worlds can be malakim, or malakim. One other thing that's particularly significant about the attempt to translate the books that became the Old Testament and even New Testament material is you have certain words that are extremely important. For instance, Hebrew developed from Sumerian, and then Babylonian developed from Sumerian, and Hebrew really developed from both of those. And many of the words in Hebrew today are the same words that we find in ancient Sumerian and Babylonian. One of those words that crops up quite a few times in the Old Testament is the word Shem. Now the word Shem with the Sumerians and the Babylonians had up to 30 definitions, 30 variations. But the root meaning of the word meant that which shoots upward, skyward. When you go back and translate or insert that definition into some of the more compelling and interesting verses in the Old Testament, you get a totally different reading. There were Nephilim in those days, sometimes translated as giants, but may well have meant those that came down from the sky. That's what the word Nephilim means more accurately than there were giants in the earth in those days. And the sons of God met the daughters of men and found them fair and bore children unto them. These were the men of old. The men of the original texts read Shem. Now that has been interpreted as men of great renown, or great men of the past. But if you interpret the literal, the early root meaning of the word, if you insert that, then you get these men that came down and mated with the daughters of men were the men of the rocket ships, the men of that which shot skyward. You get a totally different reading of the scriptures very, very quickly. If you look at the Tower of Babel section, you'll see that again the word Shem appears, and if we insert the early root meaning of the word Shem there, we get that these people were trying to raise a Shem, which suggests to me that they were building, there were, let's say, launching pads for our ET visitors. They had their bases. This must have been a rebel group, maybe with some ETs helping them out. It could have been a faction of Earthman, semi-hybrids, and ETs themselves that were a rebel group. They were trying to build a launching facility and raise their flying objects into the air. And of course, let's call him the central commander at that time, said, no, we can't do that. We've got to split these people up and tear that launching facility down. So you see how different a reading you can get, and how different our history would be, and our philosophy and our religion today, if this is the true translation of those manuscripts, and I believe it is. When I did When Men Are Gods, I tried to place UFO phenomenon in the 20th century, and not only what is it, but why is it here, and what does it mean for us, And I think first of all, we're not certain of any of, we don't know how to answer those questions. But I think we have to come to grips sooner or later with the reality that we do have not just maybe one species visiting us. We have a great amount of evidence now that suggests that we're a curiosity in one way or another for many extraterrestrial species right now. We have all kinds of problems, and they have many scientific expeditions here to study us and our problems and our attempts to work them out. Now, all of their agendas, I don't believe, are the same. Some are working with others, and so that you have overlapping agendas, but some are on their own programs. You can't assume that any species that's here at a given moment is doing the same research that another group of reported aliens somewhere else on the planet is doing. But we're a polyglot, polychrome world. We've got many races, and this has caused, in our attempt to assimilate ourselves among each other, has caused some terrific strains in the world. I mean, we have religions clashing against religion. We have political ideas clashing with other political ideas. I think most of these species come from worlds where that's not the case. They come from worlds where are one species worlds. And actually, contactees have been told, your world has real problems. We don't have quite the problems you do because we're more homogeneous and not at ends with ourselves. So we're fantastic scientific material. And we're almost an experiment. How we got this way, I don't know. I suggest that we had visitors as long as several 100,000 years ago, right down to the present, at one time or another. But quite a few visitors of different species over time. Some of those stayed and colonized, and their colonies got in trouble, and they attempted to leave, and many of them did. Some of their colonies were destroyed. They weren't able to leave. Some of them were crash landers. I wouldn't discount that possibility. So what I conceive of, and this might sound far out to many people, but it doesn't sound far out to me. It makes more and more sense as time goes on. Is that we're a hybrid species now because we have interacted. The sons of God have gotten to the daughters of men, and we carry their genes. We carry genes from probably several different extraterrestrial species, and now we have to learn to understand ourselves and somehow solve these huge problems of pollution and the threat of nuclear war and overpopulation. That's what interests them. Many of them probably they're doing sociological, anthropological research. They want to see. They want to try and understand what's happening here. Maybe some of them have had the same problems before, or maybe they fear they will. Also, as I said, I believe we're so much crossbred. There's been so much cross-hybridization that they're somewhat interested in the effects of that too. I would be. Maybe I'm looking at it from a human Earth point of view, but I would imagine if we went to another planet, if we had the resources and the machinery, and I'm not so sure we don't, that we would be doing the same kind of research there.
One more question. So where do you think the future is going to lead us with this?
Future? I would tend to subscribe to the Hopi Indian vision of the future, and that's that we're at the end of one age, one sun, and by sun they mean thousands of years, and we're moving into another. The Mayans in Yucatan have the same philosophy, really. And the Hopi say that it's up to man whether he'll survive and in what way he'll survive, whether it'll become a living hideous hell or whether we can pull off a major gambit and somehow learn to live with each other in peace and harmony. This is a shot of Jesus Sanchez. You see he's holding a machete. He struck a chupacabra that was stealing or killing his chickens. He struck the chupacabra. He struck the chupacabra twice. The first blow he said was a very good one. The creature did not go down. It didn't bleed. He said it made the sound of a drum, boom, boom, when he hit it. Okay. The next photo here. Oops, that's. Wait a minute. Do I have two of that? No. All right. This is Fire Chief Julio Zalduando Morales. This is the man in the town of Agua Buenas who took chupacabra hair off of his barbed wire fence the morning after he shot it at one. Okay. This is Madeline and Miguel Agosto. They live in the foothills of El Yunque National Rainforest.
Can you move your fingers?
Yeah. This young lady was standing 3 feet away from a chupacabra when she saw it. Her husband, by the way, a couple of days later saw one while he was on the street. This way. You're going to interview for her. You don't need that. This young man's name is Jose Arriaga. He works in a mountain radio station. A UFO, people called in at midnight when he was on the air and said, "There's a big UFO hovering over your station." The meter was 58 feet high, the antenna. He went out, and the 30-foot wide by 20-foot high UFO was hovering right at the top of it. The next day, the next evening, a chupacabra, when he opened the door at the radio station, a chupacabra was running across the yard of it about 100 feet away. Say this, of the hundreds and hundreds of cases, chupacabra cases in Puerto Rico, we don't really have one verified, convincing instance of an attack on human beings. Several human beings have been touched, and then they freaked out. They started to run and tripped and broke their leg or sprained their ankle. But I say this because we're getting a few reports now from Mexico that people have been attacked as such. And Jorge Martin, the excellent ufologist in Puerto Rico, and I find it almost a contradiction from the evidence that we've turned up.
So what do they look like?
Well, it's interesting. If you put a composite together, you get a creature that, when it's standing on its 2 legs, approximately 5 feet tall. It's covered with gray to grayish-brown hair. The hair, and I have a sample, ask me about that in a minute because I'd like to tell you about it. But the hair is roughly 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch long, and it's fine hair, even finer than squirrel hair. It has a face that, and actually kind of body proportions that look a little bit like a kangaroo. A snouty face that comes down kind of kangaroo style. The eyes, when the creature's excited or at night, the eyes are red. Slightly slanted, fairly large, and red. Although it appears that sometimes the eyes are blue and can turn a kind of greenish blue, but very often the creature's seen with red eyes. This, by the way, isn't unusual in the ET UFO field, find creatures with red eyes. It may have a lot to do with the light level from wherever they come. And well, let me finish the description of chupacabras. They have fairly long arms, a little bit meaty in the upper areas, tapering down to smaller forearms, and 3 digits, 3 fingers or digits, and with claws on the end. The feet, we're not sure, but we know that the torso area is fairly broad. Now remember, this animal is standing up in 5 feet. It's probably no more than 100 pounds or so. The torso area is fairly. I'm Professor G. Cope Shellhorn. I was a college English prof for 20 years. In 1984, I decided, after a few rather personal experiences, I decided to go out in the woods and write a few books. The first book I did was called Extraterrestrials and Biblical Prophecy. Now, about 30 years ago or more, Eric von Daniken said that someone should go to the Old Testament, New Testament, and other world scriptures and do a really thorough job. Well, no one had. The theologians didn't do their job. I had read Barry Downing, the Reverend Barry Downing's book, UFOs and the Bible, but he concentrated on the book of Exodus. Then there was a NASA scientist, Blumreich, who had done a book called The Spaceships of Ezekiel, which was very interesting, but that focused just on the book of Ezekiel. Other than that, except for a little very short book done in the 50s by M.K. Jessup called UFO and the Bible, there really hadn't been much of a treatment of scriptures, Old Testament, New Testament, pseudoepigrapha, apocrypha, or treatment of scriptures from other countries in the world. So one cold winter night, I sat down and I started to work, and I thought, nobody's going to ever want to buy this book. And fortunately they did, that I guess you could say launched my ufology career.
So how about the chupacabras in Puerto Rico?
Well, over the last year and a half in Puerto Rico, they've had a lot of, well, they're always having UFO activity. Puerto Rico's the most active place in the world per square mile for UFO activity. But around March of 1995, there were increasing reports of a strange creature that was mutilating animals. They call it chupacabras because chupa means suck, and what happened was that we had a herd of goats mutilated in Puerto Rico, and so the name chupacabra stuck. But actually the chupacabra creature, whatever it is mutilating just about any domestic or wild animal that it can get its hands on when it's hungry. But all it usually does is suck the blood. It doesn't eat flesh. Usually it makes a hole in the neck area about the size of a common nail hole, and then withdraws the blood from that. Excuse me. Sometimes you'll find marks, other holes on the torso itself, and on rare occasions it will go for the liver or the heart, and it'll make a larger hole in the liver area, and then seem to, with some kind of tongue or some kind of probe, it probes into the liver area and then feeds off the liver or the heart area. But most of the time it's interested in blood. And everything from rabbits, chickens, goats, cows, horses, even rats have been attacked by chupacabras. But I think it's important to